The myth of accessibility. One word, many layers. We celebrate it, we brand ourselves with it, build entire professional identities around it. Let me begin with where I live, inside music. I have spent my entire adult life and more as a musician, a practitioner, educator, coach, student, composer, writer, producer, navigating one of the most psychologically and physically demanding, economically precarious, and structurally layered professional ecosystems that exist. The 3-decade plus journey gave me the privilege to have interacted with a range of humans that include the likes of multiple Grammy Award winners, vice presidents of national music councils, Oscar winners, best-selling authors, underground icons who became household names, and household names who disappeared into obscurity, intentionally or otherwise. A glimpse of every rung of that particular ladder, often several at once, sometimes actively, on other occasions, passively. I start with this not to impress, but to orient you with what I'm going to try and address tonight. Because what I've learned from inside this world is a lot more than just music, but something far more universal. Something every one of us navigates on a regular basis, regardless of our profession, background, or relationship to the arts or otherwise. Music simply happened to have been the laboratory in which I was eventually forced to see it with the clarity I did. And this is what it looked like over and over again. A persistent gap in every configuration of relationship, professional or otherwise, between what was declared on the record and the actual unfolding of the same. Let's discuss. Welcome to another session solocast. These solocasts were designed to help independent artists and musicians like you navigate the very complex labyrinth that is your artistic practice and career. They're based on empirical research and experiences of my own career as an independent musician and an educator and coach working with artists just like you. The primary aim behind these sessions is to offer accessibility to the kind of education many of us need to work with in order to forward ourselves in these very confusing times as empowered and independent artists in the truest sense of the word. A word with two meanings. Now, I just got off a 30-hour flight, well, not the whole flight, after spending about 3 weeks in what I'm referring to as survival mode. Trying to get back home to Berlin, not knowing if I would be able to. Finally, finding out that the flight I had booked does get to fly, with airspaces in the midst of a war that had finally opened up. And then being made to sit on the flight for 2 hours on a nail-biting finish to figuring out if, in fact, we were going to be allowed to fly. Now, compared to what a lot of people in the world are going through, that's not a lot. But say that to my brain, a brain that's been struggling. I'm not a huge fan of that word, as many of you might know, but struggling nonetheless to come to terms with a lot of the dynamics going around in the world in the current scenario. I always make it a point to specify that I don't consider myself qualified to comment on the record on certain political dynamics existing in the world, but it does get me to think on the role I play in the entire ecosystem, my world, which is, as mentioned earlier, music. Not just music as a therapeutic tool, but music as a profession, as a vocation, something I have dedicated my life to. A word with two meanings, a word very relevant to what I just riffed upon. It's a word that finds its way into nearly every dynamic inside the world I mentioned earlier on, my world, music. And even more so in the past decade, to the best of my observations. Artist bios, brand manifestos, mission statements of organizations that once stood, and in many cases still stand, behind velvet ropes. Accessibility. In education, arts, business, leadership, even travel, politics, figureheads claim to be accessible now, with a proverbial open door. Everyone wants to, quote unquote, connect. And on one level, this is genuinely true. The internet, globalization, has made tools, information, and platforms available in ways that simply did not exist a generation ago. That's real, and it matters. But it's still a surface truth, and not a complete one just yet. And the gap between the two is where this conversation actually begins. Accessibility as a concept performs two functions simultaneously in the real world. One, signaling virtue, and two, deflecting scrutiny. An accessible person will aim, often anyways, to be immune to the accusation of gatekeeping. An accessible platform will hope to avoid the adjective exploitative being used to describe it. But in my experience, across every level, the louder the advertisement of this accessibility, the more carefully one would be advised to examine what exactly access is being granted to. The performance of openness, in many cases, runs a very high risk of being a more evolved form of the very closed door it claims to replace. In the arts, a structural version of this is particularly exposed, because the starkness of it all makes it visible in a way that other vocations might find easier to conceal. When you choose to operate as an independent artist, you are, whether one tells you or not, choosing to run what is essentially a small business. And often with no formal business training, infrastructure, or even honest acknowledgement that this is what the job comes with. So the negotiation landscape that follows will involve a gamut of partners, venues, labels, publishers, booking agents, collaborators, co-artists, engineers, in my case podcast guests, and all the teams they come with in between. With every single relationship involved carrying its own specific power geometry. Every handshake, a silent mutual calibration of individual needs in a specific transaction that usually goes unnamed. For most of my career, I conducted these negotiations alone, often in the name of authenticity, independence. It felt like integrity, a lot of heavy words there. And in many ways it was, and hopefully still is. But the weight of the accumulated physical, psychological, and professional costs while navigating each of these power differentials without support began to tell a different truth at some point. One that I hadn't really been ready to hear for the longest time. The myth of the self-sufficient individual in any domain is not a liberating one, but just a structurally convenient one. Isolated people are easier to manage, control, even exert dominance over. A person who believes they should need no one is simply easier to undervalue, underpay, and even overlook. This is as true in a social setting as it is on a corporate hierarchy or a record label's roster. The concept of independence, when misunderstood, serves those who benefit from our isolation, and not us ourselves. There are three selves involved here. Though far more widespread than we admit, a particular aspect creative professionals navigate more visibly than most is the constant triangulation between three identities, all of which bear our name but serve very different functions. These are 1. The profile, the part we can actually build ourselves with a varying but large degree of agency. The persona, the version of the same that interfaces with the world in real time, in meetings, on stage, in negotiations, and is enmeshed and often even defined by external perceptions. And then there's the self, number 3, the private human being, with its needs, wounds, genuine passions, and fatigue involved in coordinating all three. Contemporary culture, most notably social media, has created conditions in which the wall between these three is collapsing at breakneck speed. Audiences no longer want the polished product at the end of the process, but proximity to the human in the thick of it all. Vulnerability, once the domain of private life, is now a valuable currency, and authenticity, quote unquote, a brand value. And so we are, at best, encouraged, and in the worst case, compelled to open the aperture increasingly wider at a pace that leaves us with very little space to gauge our own comfort levels with the degree of accuracy needed in the entire process. And meanwhile, the actual consequences that might be involved are something we rarely have explained to us. There's some research context here for those of you, as always, interested in the references. Have a look at the article that comes with this post. Dr. Renee Brown, a research professor at the University of Houston, has spent over 2 decades studying vulnerability, courage, and shame. Her findings are unambiguous. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our most accurate measure of courage and the necessary precondition for genuine connection. But her research also documents the armor we deploy to avoid it. Perfectionism, cynicism, the need to be the knower rather than the learner. These are not personality flaws, they're learned survival strategies, often rewarded, particularly in professional environments. Now, I've been doing this, what I do, long enough to experience what happens when honest, vulnerable communication is received not with reciprocation, but as an invitation to establish a power dynamic I never signed up for. I've also been on the other side, holding my ground minus the levels of awareness that would qualify it for equality in an idealistic sense of the word. Both positions are instructive and available to all of us, artist or not. And this is where the science becomes uncomfortable in the most useful way. Further research by psychologists at UC Berkeley and Stanford, you can check out the exact names on the article, documents what they call the approach inhibition theory of power. In plain terms, elevated power activates what can be referred to as approach tendencies. So when we see someone with elevated power, our tendency is to want to approach them. It has a positive effect on our brain. Reduced power, on the other hand, when we perceive the person with lesser power, activates pretty much the opposite. Inhibition tendencies like vigilance, attention to threat, and socially constrained behavior is a bit counterintuitive, but backed by research. Some more heavy-duty research context for you. One of the most replicated findings in social psychology, confirmed by a subsequent meta-analysis of 813 independent samples across over 200,000 participants, found that elevated social power is associated with diminished empathic accuracy and reduced compassion in response to another's distress. Not because powerful people are inherently callous, but because power changes what the brain attends to. Now, let's do a simpler translation of what I just referred to. I know that's pretty complex. The translation here is power doesn't just change what we do, it changes what we notice, how we feel, and how we process our perception of people. The person who holds more power in a given interaction is neurologically predisposed to attend less carefully to our experience of it. This is less a moral judgment and more a documented feature of how the human brain responds to social position. And it operates everywhere. We are consistently drawn to those who maintain an aura of unreachability, even as they list accessibility among their highest values. And understanding why this is tells us way more about the human nervous system than any professional framework ever could. Access can also be a hiding ground for theft for certain products. This brings me to one of the most brazen examples of quote-unquote accessibility being commodified recently. Suno AI. Now you might have known that I'm not a fan. Suno AI is a platform that allows anyone, regardless of musical training or ability, to generate what sounds like a professionally produced song from a text prompt. It's not, by the way. It's fake. It's not a real song. It's not even real music. But type a few words, press a button, you receive a full track with vocals sung by no one, instrumentation played by no one, arrangement produced by no producer. You get it all. And the pitch is insultingly simple in its appeal. Music made, you guessed it, accessible. So, no apparent gatekeepers, no conservatory to establish training standards, no investment in practice needed, no need to collaborate with, compensate, or even acknowledge a single human musician. The biggest problem, though, is how the product actually works. In June 2024, three of the biggest music companies in the world, Sony, Universal, and Warner. Now, I'm not a huge fan of major labels and the music industry per se, but still, to be fair, these three companies sued Suno and its rival, Udio, for stealing music. The charge was simple. Suno had helped itself to an enormous catalog of copyrighted recordings without asking, without paying, and according to the lawsuit, had been deliberately vague about the entire process, because an honest answer would have been damning to it all. The actual legal record is mentioned on the article that comes with this podcast episode. You can go check it out if you're curious. But the legal dimension, significant as it is not actually the sharpest part of the story for our purposes. The rhetorical one is. The word Suno most consistently continues to use to describe what it offers is, of course, accessible. Music for everyone, creation without barriers, the democratization of sound, community. I believe the founder compares it to video game community, something on those lines. The human musicians, producers, and engineers whose work was ingested without consent, without credit, and without compensation, though, to make the product function and nowhere in the picture. So the decades of practice, collaboration, failure, growth, and earned understanding that were extracted as raw material and then repackaged as a feature via a software that explicitly makes those decades apparently unnecessary just go completely unacknowledged. So I realize this might feel a little tangential to what I'm addressing, but this is actually a fantastic example of accessibility as strip mining. The appearance of an open door built from the timber of doors that were forced upon people clueless to the occurrence of any of these events behind closed doors. That is where the Snow story rejoins the broader one with uncomfortable precision. The mechanism is not new. It's simply a more technologically advanced version of an ancient dynamic. The appropriation of human depth and labor to produce the appearance of accessibility while ensuring that the people whose depth and labor made it possible in the first place are completely excluded from the transaction. How do I deal with this as a musician? As a practicing musician who's basically dedicated his entire life to getting better at serving that art? Well, I listen to the music, the real music. And then music spoke. What I find the most fascinating and a bit ironic, given that I've spent the amount of time honing my musical skills, immersed in music, is a realization that is quite positive and life-giving, actually, when I think of it. For all the complexity and murkiness of the music industry, music itself, the actual organized arrangement of sound, the practicing of making it together, contains a clarity about power, structure, beauty, and humanity that the noise of the industry has always obscured. You see, music is not just music to me. It's my guiding light, a truth system, the reply to questions I often don't even know I was asking. And every time I've stopped long enough to actually hear what I was saying the whole time, the moment has carried a slight sense of embarrassment at realizing how long I'd needed to see what was staring me in the face the whole time. Allow me to elaborate. Consider a symphony orchestra. If you've witnessed one live or on TV or even heard soundtracks on your favorite Netflix series, a symphony orchestra comes with, I think, 110 musicians, a conductor, stringent hierarchy, clearly defined sections, significant constraints on individual expression and spontaneous freedom. Now ask the question everyone tends to ask first. Why all the rules? Is it tradition, elitism, an institution protecting its own structures? Now, none of these can be dismissed, but the deeper answer, more musical one, is something else entirely. At that scale, the constraints are not ideological, but a bigger plan for a much larger sonic endeavor and harmony. And with 110 players in a room, if every individual performer expressed themselves with random individual freedom simultaneously, the result would not be liberation, but dissonance to the point of noise. Discipline is not in opposition to harmony, it's the precondition for it. The orchestra is not hierarchical at its atomic level, it's responding to physical and sonic reality at an entirely different scale. The structure involved exists not to suppress what is being made, but to allow its existence in that expanded form in the first place. Now, reduce the ensemble, a string quartet, trio, or duo, and the dynamic shifts immediately. Not because someone decided to be more democratic, not by prior arrangement or ideology, but because the actual acoustic reality just changed. With fewer voices, each carried more individual weight and audibility. That freedom expands not due to results being relaxed, because the physics of it all simply permits more. With that expanded freedom, though, comes more space to stretch, a term musicians actually often use to refer to performance. And then there's the solo performer, one person, silence, and nothing else. Maximum freedom, maximum exposure, maximum responsibility. But here's the thing, the structure has still not disappeared. It's just been internalized entirely. A level of artistic demand completely exposed with nowhere to hide and every choice visible. Every moment of contact or its absence audible. The best solo performers have a masterful relationship with silence, and the best orchestras know that the space they're occupying within the same is sacred. And the access the performer receives to it is, in reality, possible only with the appropriate capacity and skill to handle it. The irony deepens, though. Musicians who live and breathe this reality, who've embodied these truths for years in their hands, ears, and nervous systems, are often the first to miss its implications for other domains of life. We resist structure in our businesses, our collaborations, our communications, and our inner lives, while simultaneously depending on it every single time we pick up an instrument. Meanwhile, the answer was always inside the music. We just kept forgetting to listen to what it was actually saying. But that law holds everywhere. Think about any organization, team, community, or relationship you've been a part of. The larger it grows, the more complex its structure tends to become. More process, more hierarchy, more protocol. Usually we will, or at least a part of us will resent this instinctively, as if structure itself were evidence of a threat to our agency, our freedom. Accessibility being created for hierarchy's sake. But what if that structure is simply acoustic? The real question is, or was, never why so many rules, but are those rules in service of a deeper purpose, a real purpose? Not a self-serving display of power hidden behind institutionalized industrial or corporate ego, but a deeper intentionality that transcends the entire spiel completely. Because the moment structure and the doors it comes with stop serving the music being the metaphor here, something predictable happens. The language of accessibility gets louder than needed. Pompous open door policies announced, values written on the wall. It's the sound I've come to recognize of an ensemble that's forgotten what harmony was ever supposed to be about, and often end up justifying it with the scapegoat that accessibility misinterpreted can be. There, I said it. David, Goliath, and the sling. You folks know the story? David the giant. No, excuse me, Goliath the giant and David the tiny guy who eventually overcomes him, throwing a stone at him with a sling. Now, I've been David in this story. Outgunned, under-resourced, finding unexpected angles, surviving. I've also been something closer to Goliath, occupying space that someone else wished to enter and didn't have the means to, didn't have the resources to occupy. Both are instructive and available to all when the context is in alignment with the larger picture. And what I've come to understand through my experiences is this. David and Goliath are both roles, costumes that situations hand us. Costumes we can step into, often without noticing, and sometimes forget to step out of. Also, systems are very good at casting people. They need their Davids, to sustain the myth that they can be beaten, and Goliaths to ensure the power stays looming. Both roles serve the structure, and neither is the entire truth of who we are. And the most challenging, if not pertinent, question in that arena is this: who am I when I am neither? Hopefully, just a person engaged in something real with others trying to do just the same. Accountable to the work, each other, and nothing else. Music taught me to tell the difference between a real connection and its performative version. A structure that serves the sound and that which serves vested interests in its name. A door that is truly open to those who seek harmony, and the one with a glowing neon sign proclaiming quote-unquote access to the same. That, more than anything else I have learned in this profession, is why music remains my guiding light. And I suspect, whether or not you have played a note ever in your life, that some part within you has always known the difference as well. Hope that helps.
Hey folks, I hope you found that episode helpful. Here's a little request. If you did, consider sharing this episode with your folks. Think about the ways in which they might benefit the way you did. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out if you have queries. My name's TL. I'm an independent musician and educator and the founder of the Holistic Musician Academy.